So now that I'm back from Vietnam and our tour in Asia, I wanted to get Moon back on the phone. Moon, welcome back to My Home is Special.
Yay! Thank you for having me back.
Moon, I wanted to just touch base quickly because you gave us a lot of things that were special to you, and we missed the New Year celebration. But we went on a tour of Ho Chi Minh City the first full day we were there, and then we found a street food tour. And we
Oh,
went and tried like 10 different spots around the city. And you had mentioned street food at the end of our conversation. Moon, you undersold it. It was so good. And that was probably the thing that set the tone for the rest of our time in Vietnam. We went back to a lot of those places and were immediately like looking for food to eat everywhere we went. How come you didn't tell me the street food was so amazing?
I think words just can't describe the street food culture in Vietnam. You just had to be there.
That's so true. We ate like champs during the entire 2 weeks we were in Vietnam. But the second thing we did after that was we found a woman who was doing a coffee tasting and a coffee making class. And you mentioned the coffee culture there. And I was telling you a little bit earlier before I pressed record that she was like a mad scientist. You know,
Oh, okay.
she was measuring out the coffee, measuring out the milk. She was timing all of the different elements of it. And she told us that you have to wait because if you don't have to wait, it's not worth having.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. Remember when I said it's feel like when you're waiting for that coffee, it's like the moment that the space, the time, everything condensed in that coffee cup.
Absolutely. And she was actually down an alley. So we had our grab driver drop us off at the address and then walked around for 5 minutes because we couldn't find the little opening for the alley. And when we found it, we had to walk all the way down this alley. And there was this like amazing coffee shop that we never would have found any other way except for the fact that we found her online and booked it. And it
I
was really
really
cool.
appreciate the fact that you definitely took my advice because I remember I was telling you that like it's not anything that you can find like off the street. Like you have to go into those places that is tucked into a corner.
Oh my gosh, you weren't lying. And when I say she was a mad scientist, like we were talking, it was just us, and she was doing this little demonstration for us and helping us, and we made our own coffee. And we looked over, and she had an espresso machine, and there was an autograph on it. And I was like, "What is that?" She goes, "Oh, I got the this world champion barista signed my coffee machine." I was like, I didn't know I didn't even know that was the thing. But she was really into it. You know, we spent some time there. We went to Da Nang and then went up to Hanoi. And in Hanoi, which I think is your home city, right?
Yes, sir.
We went around the city a lot. We weren't dressed. We didn't realize we needed to have certain attire to go into some of the sites that people were seeing. But we went by Peace and Love House, which was
Oh, nice. How was that?
I could see why it was cool. There was a lot of boutiques in there. Sadly, we got there and the restaurant was closed, and then the bar on the top it never opened. They were closed for the afternoon, so we didn't get a chance to go in. But we saw the neighborhood and we met some people in there and did some looking around at some of the boutiques in there. And I could see how you could just go there and spend all kinds of time just hanging out.
Absolutely.
And then the highlight of the trip was in Hanoi because we had dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Moon. Your parents actually took us out to dinner.
Man, that was so crazy to me. Like I showed everybody here in Chicago the pictures of you and your wife with my family, and it's just crazy. The most ambitious crossover ever. This is better than Marvel. It was so crazy to me to see two worlds that I never thought would ever collide, and like they're here. Like everybody's meeting and talking to each other.
It was so cool because you told us, you were like, hey, this is a little weird, but I told my parents about you and they want to meet you all. And I was like, I think you got my response. I was like, absolutely. Here's the day. We're in. They took us to a restaurant. And honestly, Moon, what was really cool about it was we had a few days in Hanoi, but we went out to Halong Bay. And so we were in the old city and we were walking because we didn't have a car and we didn't have any other place to go. And they took us out of the old city to an awesome restaurant. And we just had like the best meal we had in Vietnam was definitely that night. And it was great to just meet your parents and talk a little bit about Vietnam as best we could through your cousin, who was our translator.
That was awesome. I am so glad to hear that. Yeah, I'm just grateful that that trip happened and that you get to meet them and that you also brought a piece of Chicago to them.
Yes, no doubt. And they had an entire list of things that I have to do with them next time I'm back. So if we go back to Radical Force next year and swing through Hanoi, I know I have to catch up with both of your parents next time.
Absolutely.
So Moon, we're going to catch up in Chicago soon in person, but I just wanted to get you back on the podcast and thank you for sharing a little bit about your home and giving us a great list of things to take advantage of while we were there above and beyond what tourists do when they're in Vietnam. It made the trip that much more special for us. So thank you.
Of course, and thank you for, creating this space for not just me, but all these just birds being away from the nest and get to talk about our home and where we come from. Like that's amazing. And I really do appreciate you for creating this space for us.
Welcome to My Home is Special. My name is Taylor, and thank you so much, Keith, for having me on for this recap episode of Vietnam. I'm so excited. Are you ready to go?
Let's do it.
Let's jump right in. I have a little bit more knowledge about Vietnam than some of the other countries that we've talked about and are going to discuss. And I know that it's a pretty bustling place. So, where did you end up starting? And was traffic any better than some of the other places?
That's funny you would ask. So we started down south because we were coming from Cambodia. So we were sort of in that direction. So we started in Ho Chi Minh City, which was Saigon, which was a little confusing for me as I was booking the tickets because the airport had both names. But we started down there, and just right off the top, traffic was similar to Cambodia, but not quite the same. There were a ton of motorbikes, and there were just swarms of them everywhere. Definitely more crowded and more populous than what we saw in both stops in Cambodia. And so you knew you were in a different place because it was just a much bigger, bustling, busy city.
I know Moon gave you some really cool stuff to check out just from listening to it. Were you able to get to it all?
One of the things we always try and do when we get to a new city, basically because of these trips, we just realize it's good to get oriented to the city. We're not doing these 1 day, 2 day stops everywhere. So if we're going to be someplace for a couple days, we start with a city tour. So our first full day in Vietnam, we actually started in the morning with a moped tour. My dumbass thought they were going to come deliver mopeds or bring us to a spot where we could get mopeds. Instead, we booked for two people. So two people came and picked us up and we rode on the back of their motorbikes through traffic, into traffic. It was pretty harrowing. I mean, they were both college students doing an Airbnb experience. And so they were taking us around to see the sights, to stop by some of the tourist places and just get around the city in a way that would have taken us forever in a car or if we were walking. And then we stopped for lunch. And that was sort of the first taste of Vietnamese food for us. And it was really awesome. And it was really definitely, certainly at a place that we never would have stopped at if we had walked by because it just didn't look like it was going to be good. And I was like, oh, I'm going to get sick if I eat here. But the food was fantastic. And it was the first stop that we made for food. And it was well worth it.
You and motorbikes, Keith. I'm gonna need you to stay as far away from them as possible for future trips.
There
Okay.
was no chance you could stay away from them in Vietnam, but you can call a Grab motorbike and somebody will come on their motorbike and you can hop on the back. We did not do that, although it was significantly cheaper and probably faster, so it was very tempting, but we didn't. We resisted the urge.
Yeah, just I would be concerned for your safety. That would be my only thing.
Yeah. Now, Moon also, she talked about the street food and she talked about some other stuff. And we did, after that motorbike tour, I think that same night, we actually had a street food tour for dinner. And we met up again with a guide off Airbnb Experiences who took us on a vegan street food tour. I felt like that was a safer way to go. She calls it segan. She's a vegetarian or a vegan that eats seafood. But we felt like a vegan street food tour would get us out and get us to try some new types of food without putting at risk eating meat that had been sitting out there roasting all day or something like that. And it was awesome. We had a great time.
Okay, so you mentioned a little bit about food, the vegan street food tour. Was there any other food that you got to taste? And can you kind of describe some of the food? Because I'm getting hungry just thinking about it.
Yeah, so honestly pretty proud of myself because not only did I try the street food everywhere we stopped, I ate things that I normally would just never eat. I'm not an adventurous eater. Like there's beef, there's pork, there's chicken, and there's fish. There's not like a lot of reason to go try other animals and try other parts of animals. Like I'm just that ain't my thing. I'm not into like the whole Fear Factor street food tour. He took us, I think it was on like 10 stops. And so we had these fried rice patties that were pan fried. We had noodles. We had a version of pho. We had desserts. We stopped by a fruit stand and tried like 6 or 7 different types of fruits that I'd never even heard of before. And they were all really good. We also had a chance to try some drinks on the street. So we tried some local beer, which I'm not a big beer drinker, but it was fine. In addition to the beer, we had a few other drinks along the way. And I forgot, earlier in the day on the moped tour, we stopped and picked up some pressed sugarcane juice. And they mixed it with some kumquat. And it was just like this really awesome flavor. And they made it with durian, but we didn't want to try durian because it's a really stinky fruit. And later in the day at the street tour, we got to try it again. And Tasha actually tried the durian. And it wasn't that bad, but it did smell really terrible.
From the little bit I know, shout out to Tasha because she's not scared. She's just not scared to go for it, and
No.
I appreciate it.
No, she eats a lot of good stuff. By the way, a couple of the hotels on the trip made me sign a contract when I checked in that said no smoking in the room and no eating durian in the room, to give you a sense of how bad durian smells. Like it was like a $250 fine if I lit a cigarette or ate durian in the room.
I know the listeners can't see this, but I'm actually slack-jawed.
It was crazy. It's crazy. I've never heard of that before. But, Moon had suggested the street food was something that she missed at the very end. She was saying how much she looked forward to doing it. And when we saw that there was a street food tour that we could do on the first day, we were in. And it was awesome. And Tasha immediately became the biggest fan of Vietnamese food. In fact, we went back to a couple of those places the next day when we could. And that set off a basically 2-week frenzy of eating like lunatics throughout the country.
We talk a lot about history and the museums that you visit, and I think they're one of my favorite parts. And I know you just mentioned being able to visit some. Can you talk about some of the ones you visit, or at least your most memorable?
We spent a ton of time at the War Remnants Museum, and I had read about it and sort of said, it seems interesting, and they don't hold back, right? And first thing you notice is that they refer to what we call the Vietnam War as the American War, and they refer to it as sort of the war with America. And I was like, oh, yeah, I guess from their perspective, that's what they would call it. It was in Vietnam, but it was the American War, and there was a war with the Americans. And the museum did not hold anything back. It had an entire room of exhibits on the atrocities that the American troops committed in Vietnam, massacring villages and burning things down and killing civilians. And it was documented. I mean, they had their sources, they had their photos. Some of the guys who were leading those troops, ended up in Congress after the war, and they didn't hold back. And they had a whole exhibit on the effects of Agent Orange and the birth defects that it caused and the other deaths that it caused afterwards. And, it talked a lot about how the American military did a bunch of really horrible things in Vietnam. And it's just interesting because you don't see that at the museums here. You don't really talk about it. But Taylor, it's really interesting how they talk about history, not just in the museum, but in other parts of the country. On the moped tour we were on, we stopped by this house, and it was a house that a couple owned, and they had built like this tunnel system underneath the house. And I have pictures of it. Like you move a bookcase and there's a tunnel behind it, and it goes into a secret basement where they were hiding weapons. And they tunneled to the couple of houses next door, and they had like all these weapons caches in the house. And we were trying to understand who they were and what they were doing, because the museum talked about them like heroes of the war. And South Vietnam was where the Americans were, and North Vietnam was the communist Vietnam. And that's what the fight was. And Vietnam, from what I could tell, is run by the Communist Party. And so it's safe to say we lost the war. If we were trying to prop up the South, the North won. Ho Chi Minh apparently was leading the troops in the north, and the South Saigon is now named Ho Chi Minh City. So you win, you get to name the city. And they were talking about this as heroes, and Tasha and I were trying to figure out like, oh, well, the couple was in the South, so they were part of the resistance for the South. So we went home and we looked it up, and they were actually storing weapons to help the North fight and subvert the government in the South. But because the North arguably won the war, they talk about them like heroes. And if we were reading about them here, they would be the villains because they were fighting on the side of the communists.
That makes sense.
It was interesting because it was just another good example of like, oh, when you change the perspective, everything else changes.
It's about who wins.
Yeah.
That's who tells the story.
Our pastor always says, until the lion gets to tell their story, the hunter will always be the hero.
That is literally what I wish I would have learned more about in every history class I've ever had. You've mentioned Radical Force Jam once to me before, and it's always sounded really special. No pun intended. Um, what is Radical Force Jam, and did you get to go?
Radical Force Jam is a huge hip hop battle that took place in Singapore before COVID. And it just so happened that my work trips would take me over to Singapore basically the week before. So I'd have to do this thing on Thursday before the Friday, Saturday, Sunday jam. So the first time I went was in 2018. I basically finished up at work and then decided to stay for the weekend so I could go to this thing and was blown away. I was like, this is amazing. I'm coming back every year. They had hundreds of dancers from around the world, a big chunk of them from Asia and Australia. Literally hundreds of dancers. They had an open styles competition, which is really fun to watch. They had the B-boys and B-girls inside. It was just great. It was a great day and great night of amazing talent on display. So I went in 2018. I went in 2019. I literally had my tickets and plans to go in 2020, but it's in March every year.
Oh no!
And the pandemic started in Asia, so they shut down and canceled it. It went away and it came back last year, 2023, I believe, in Vietnam. He moved it from Singapore to Da Nang. I'm not going to lie, when we decided to do these trips, I 100% planned my time in Asia around making sure that I could be in Da Nang for Radical Force Jam 2024.
So this is literally your safe, like this is your dream space.
It is a really, really great event. The footage is online, and I think I'm in some of the videos because I'm always right on the stage taking photos. It was great. We were a little concerned because Tosh was with me this time, and it is a long day. I mean, Friday starts at 3 o'clock, finishes at like 10. And then Saturday starts earlier and finishes around the same time. So we got there a little bit later, but we were there for 6 or 7 hours both days watching the competitions. And what was really cool this year was they do a beach party on Sunday. And it's my anniversary weekend, so I can stay Friday, Saturday, but I need to fly home so I could be back for our anniversary. But she was with me this time. So for the first time, I actually stayed for the beach party. And what was really wild was, as talented as some of these folks are, they're just people. And so we met them all, hung out with them all. Tasha took pictures with her favorite dancers. I think one from Japan, this 10-year-old girl who was stellar. She was unreal. And she was from Indonesia. And what was really cool, Taylor, was that at the beach party, she was a 10-year-old. When she was battling, you would see her battle adults and be like, who is this little girl? But at the beach, she was like playing in the sand, like kids play in the sand. But when she was performing in the cypher, just command of the crowd. I mean, like 1,000 people in the crowd, just total command of the crowd, attitude, charisma, the whole thing. And we met her parents and we were like, so are you dancers? They were like, no, we have no idea where she gets this from. But if you watch her videos online, she is bananas. Absolutely incredible.
Would you say that it being moved to Vietnam versus being in Singapore, did it have a different feel to you at all? Or did it feel like the exact same?
No, the vibe was different. And honestly, we're already making plans to go back for next year. And what was different about it, a couple things. One, Vietnam is significantly cheaper than Singapore. And I talked with Felix, who organizes the event with his team every year, and he's been doing it for about a decade or more. Vietnam is just a lot cheaper. And then the other thing, Taylor, is it was in a convention center, so it was air conditioned. In Singapore, we were outside, 95-degree heat, sweating, and then the B-boys were inside, stinking up the place. And it was like an endurance battle, a test of wills. This was actually inside in a convention center that was air-conditioned and easily accessible, and everybody had space, and you could breathe, and it was great. So I really like the Vietnam venue, and like I said, I'm already making plans to go back.
So was that all that you did throughout your next leg of the trip, or was there a little bit more that you were able to do?
Radical Force, by far, was a special part and a special stop for us. We spent more time in Da Nang, so we had other places we wanted to see. And we did the tourist stuff. We went to Hoi An. The number of tourists there it was crazy. I mean, it was just crazy crowded when we were there with these big tour groups. Without naming names, I would say some tour groups from different countries bring a lot more drama than tour groups from other countries. But we saw some cool stuff. It's sort of known for this lantern thing that they do on the water. And so you sort of buy these little lanterns, you light a candle. I think you either say a prayer or make a wish and you put it in the water and sort of let it go. And you can take like a boat ride at sunset. And there's all these lanterns on the water. It's dark out. You may or may not get the sunset. You've got the ambiance of the stores and the people along the waterfront. And then you're on these longboats with all these lanterns in the water. And the whole area is just lit up with these really colorful lanterns. And it sounds awesome. And you're thinking like, this is going to be the Venice of Asia. And it's going to be super romantic. And we're going to get on a boat and we're going to go down the river. And you get out there and everybody has that idea. It's literally like bumper boats. There are hundreds of boats crammed into this little area. We hit at least 3 or 4 boats in this longboat because there's just so many. And so it would be romantic if everybody hadn't come up with the same idea. But it was cool. We did it. We're happy we did it. But it was a little different than advertised.
I had such a beautiful vision in mind, and then it just got...
Yeah. So did we until we got on the boat.
Well, I'm happy you at least got to share the experience. No need to visit it. Something I don't typically ask you is, how did you end the trip? I feel like you are a very intentional person, and I just feel like you don't just up and leave a country. You make a plan to leave it. So how did you end your time in Vietnam?
I'm not sure I think about it that way, Taylor, but we started in Ho Chi Minh City and we did a few days there. We did a lot of the stuff that Moon talked about. We knocked out before we left there. And then we went to Da Nang, and Da Nang was almost the midpoint of the 6 weeks we were gone. And so I actually booked the hotel for a full week, and they upgraded us in a nice way unexpectedly. So we had basically a massive apartment to ourselves for the whole week. In the middle of that week, we had the 3 days at the battle. So we actually got to chill. So Da Nang was like our mid-vacation vacation. The third stop in Vietnam was Hanoi and Ha Long Bay. And we went to Hanoi, we got in. The next day, we got on a boat going through Ha Long Bay. Like Hoi An, it was packed. But everybody who had been said it's a really special place and it's a UNESCO site and you should go. But when we started looking for boats, like everybody had a boat. Everybody said they were the best boat. So we actually asked some friends who had been. And ironically, my dental hygienist had a really great boat suggestion. And I was like, we'll do that one. The atmosphere in the place itself was really cool, and I could see how people think of it as magical. If the weather had been a little better, I might have felt the same way. But just, I've never seen like formations like that and a landscape like that, and just spent the day on the boat sort of just cruising through the bay and checking out the sights and hopping off every day for an excursion or two. It was really nice.
What would you say would be your favorite food encounter in Vietnam?
I would say the sugarcane juice and, of course, the banh mi. We did pho, and everybody would say, you got to do the pho when you're in Vietnam. And we did that. And what you don't realize necessarily is that you get spoiled. Every place you go in Vietnam has it. So I was having it every day, sometimes twice a day, because they would have a noodle bar at breakfast, and they would just make it at breakfast. And then you could get it again for lunch, and they almost always serve something like it for dinner. You ask about food. There were 2 other things that I would highlight that were really cool for us. One, we did another vegan street food tour in Hanoi. Also very good. More noodles, more rice, more fruits. Stopped by another fruit stand. Tried some familiar fruits and some new fruits again. But one of the coolest things that happened food-wise was Moon had told her parents that some friends for Chicago were going to Hanoi. And she texted me and said, this is going to sound a little weird, but I told my parents about you guys and they want to take you out to dinner. I had to install the other messaging app that they use and told them, look, my wife's basically vegetarian, so if we can find a vegetarian place, yeah, we're free. It was just a fun night, and we got to meet what I call Mr. and Mrs. Moon. And what was really funny is they don't speak English, Taylor.
So how did you communicate?
So
It's the same question.
A combination of Google Translate and Moon's younger cousin came to help us translate. And so the 5 of us sat down and had a great conversation with the cousin and Google helping us communicate with each other. It was really nice to have a great family dinner with a family that we didn't know we had on the other side of the world. And it was a great meal. It was a great night. And we took some selfies with them afterwards and texted them to Moon and said, guess who we're having dinner with tonight? And it was really cool. It was a really neat part of the trip for us. It was something totally unexpected and unplanned.
I just love when you meet people and they bring new people into your life who bring new people who bring new people, and then you get to have experiences like this. That
Exactly.
is a win.
And that was our last night in Hanoi. It was really special. It was an awesome night.
To end, as usual, the best part. What is Vietnam's story that you would share on stage with a live audience?
I really struggled to think of a single story. We did so much in Vietnam that there's a lot we could talk about. We covered a lot of ground here in what's probably going to end up being a pretty long episode unintentionally. One of our first nights in the city, and I think this was in Ho Chi Minh City, but we saw it again, time and time again, was we went walking. The street food tour ended, and we were like, you know what? It's a nice night, and we decided that we would walk back to the hotel. It was like 45 minutes. We figured we'd stop and see what there was to see, and we stumble into like a street festival. Not really like a festival with like vendors set up, but there's all these lights, and there's some street performers. There's a guy like breathing and eating fire, and it's this whole avenue is basically closed off, and they've got lights, and they've got modeling stations, they've got some museum exhibits of different attire, and the people are just out. And we start hearing this noise, and they're doing street karaoke. And I'd never really seen this before, but there would be these guys that would just set up these speakers and the microphone, and there'd be like a crowd around them, and they weren't performing. They were letting people from the crowd come do karaoke on the street. And you're walking by, you're like, what is that? And who is performing? Are they performing for money? And the answer is no, they're just performing because they want to do karaoke. And as we're walking down this avenue, we keep seeing these little stations of people just doing karaoke. And we're like, I don't think I've ever seen that before. Like, I've seen street performers, but I've never seen street karaoke. And Taylor, not a single one of the dozen or so people we walked past belonged on the microphone. I'll just say it like that, at the risk of offending people. but like, we were like, wow, this is really, really not great. But what was really weird was that as we walked back to the hotel, we would pass a few restaurants and other places that would have people also not singing great on stage, like the paid performers. And when we were on our boat, the singers, I wouldn't say were the strongest singers, but they were fun to have on board. And we kept seeing people singing, and we're like, really? Like, are these paid professional singers? But it wasn't a Vietnam thing, it turns out, because throughout the rest of our trip, we continued to see people who were really into singing and really should have had friends that helped them find other passions to pursue. But it made for a fun trip and a fun story, and I stopped and listened to the karaoke and I listened to the bands because I wanted to record some audio that I could share on this podcast. And people are listening to that as we're talking now. And I hope they enjoy it.
Hope they do too.
So Taylor, thanks for letting me share a lot about Vietnam. I could go on and on about the food tours and the museums and Radical Forest Jam. This was the longest stop on the trip. We felt like there was the most to see, and I don't feel like we saw enough of Vietnam. And so my hope is that one day we can go back and explore more of Vietnam. I felt like we hit the highlights, but that only scratched the surface. That would be like coming to the U.S. and visiting New York, Chicago, and San Francisco and claiming you saw the country. There's a lot more to it, and one of these days we'll get back. But thanks for letting me share a little bit about Vietnam, and I look forward to talking with you again on the next one.
No, thank you, Keith, for allowing me to have this recap and have this time with you. And I can't wait for our next episode of My Home is Special.
Thanks for listening to this episode of My Home is Special. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you get future episodes automatically. Go to myhomeisspecial.com for the occasional email update too. That's where links to photo galleries and a few other surprises will live. Be sure to follow KBev Photo on Instagram for behind-the-scenes footage during our journey, and it'll be in the stories. If you just want the photos, go to kbevphoto.com. There's a lot else on there to explore. For now, this is Keith, aka KBev, signing off. Peace.